All right, hey everyone, welcome to lesson 1 of the leg module. In this lesson, we'll discuss the upper parts of the leg muscles and briefly on the leg bones. And we'll see what the legs are made up of and what individual muscles they are made up of, including some of the bones. And the bones are relatively easy to remember when it comes to the upper legs. We essentially have two major bone structures, and then one that actually sits in between the upper leg and the lower leg called the patella, which is your knee joint. So as we have a look, you can see that we have one major bone structure, which is the pelvis. And we're not going to dissect the different aspects of the pelvis. To me, again, it's not as important. If you want to research it, go ahead and research it. Just look up bones of the pelvis or anatomical bones of the pelvis, and you'll find more than enough information. But again, for us, not that important. You just need to remember that the pelvis makes up a large part of your pelvic area, of course, and this is where a lot of muscles will attach to, including like the quadriceps, the glutes, and all of that. Also the back muscles, the obliques that sit on top of this iliac crest of the pelvis. The pelvis has a large function, of course, but when it comes to the bone structure itself, to me, all you would need to remember is that it just has this bucket-like shape, as we will recall in the simplification video. Then the other bone is the femur, right? So this large bone, it's also the largest bone and the thickest bone usually in your body. It has to be a very rigid bone because it takes up a lot of muscle mass. It holds a lot of muscles of the legs together, the quadriceps being one of the largest legs in the muscles. And so it's a very important bone, of course. It's very big. And what you need to know about the femur, other than it being this kind of bone that attaches on the lateral side of the pelvis, is that it has these almost two parts to it. It's not similar to the shoulder joint. It's a little bit different. So what it does is kind of branches off into like one section and then another section. And that section is actually not in a 90-degree angle. And this is where a lot of you, when you start out or when you do the mannequins, as you need to do in the beginner course, a lot of you will draw that leg straight down. So those cylinders straight down on top of each other. And as we even discussed in the beginner's course, this is not the ideal way to do it because the legs don't function that way. They tilt a little bit inwards and outwards. So they have this rhythm to them that you would have the leg going inwards a little bit and then coming outwards. And that creates this nice rhythm to the legs that is essentially dictated by the way these bones are structured. Now, I'm not sure specifically why that is. I'm pretty sure it's because of stress and added stress on top of joints that naturally we have evolved into this way, that it doesn't cause too much stress. Because an interesting piece of trivia is when they used to do hip replacement, they would just like literally bolt on a new leg. And what they quickly realize is that there's way too much stress on that joint, and it would just break off always. And new hip replacements actually look almost identical to the femur joint, and more specifically here, this area, which is called the trochanter. And so this trochanter is like that epicondyle edge of your femur that basically you can feel on your hip, right? It's the part of your hip that you can really feel. And when it comes to women, they have a much more pronounced trochanter. So they will have wider hips, but also a wider trochanter because of that. And this is essentially what creates that hourglass shape that you see, or that you graphically would see with an idealized body shape for women. It's these 2 points would actually be or represent that trochanter, and not the top part of the hip. So I sometimes see people get this wrong, where they think here's the belly button, and then this, or here's the belly button even, and then this is all still part of the abdomen, and then we go into the legs like this. That's not actually the case. It's more like the pelvis kind of sits here. This is the belly button, and this is how the legs attach to it. And that gives you that female shape, right? And that's those trochanter points that you see that make up that silhouette. And so that's the trochanter. And then lastly, we have the patella. And of course, as most of you know, the patella is the knee joint. What's really interesting about the patella is that it acts as an extra leverage point for the quadriceps to actually lift our leg. And I didn't even know this, but it adds up to 50% more leverage strength for the quadriceps, or at least the tendons, to lift the tibia and fibula bones upwards, which is really interesting. But so that's the patella that sits in between, or actually sits on top of the femur, and it kind of has this nice wedge where it can wedge into and where the tendons can run across, and that's the knee joint in itself. When it comes to movement, the only thing I want you to remember is that the femur will literally act like a ball and socket joint. It sockets into the pelvis, and that again allows it to have a lot of movement laterally, bilaterally, any way to abduct and protract the leg, and everything you want with the leg you can basically do if it were only bones. Now, of course, because of the muscle mass that we have surrounding this bone, and a lot of that restriction will be made by the glute medius and the IT band and the iliotibial band, and the tensor fasciae latae. All of these muscles and tendons and all of that will keep that joint, will keep that leg a little bit more restricted, so that we of course have power output as well, but that we don't overextend all of our muscles. It's the similar thing that we have with the arm and the elbow and all of that. So that's something you should just keep in mind, that when it comes to movement, the femur bone will act like a ball and socket joint. Now, if we look at the anterior side, or the front side of the leg muscles, we can see a myriad of different muscles. Now, some of these will definitely dictate the form and gesture of the legs. Other ones a little less so, but we'll go over them individually. So one of the major ones, of course, is the quadriceps, right? And the name explains itself again, just like the biceps, just like the triceps on the arm. The quadriceps will be made out of 4 different muscle bundles. However, we only identify 3 of them superficially. One of them is tucked underneath, which we cannot see. It has function, otherwise it wouldn't be there. But for us to remember, it's not important. So we only remember 3 distinct ones, which is the vastus medialis, which is the one that sits on the medial side. So that means on the inside of the leg. We have the rectus femoris, which is the one that connects to the femur muscle and onto the ridge of the pelvis, and the vastus lateralis, which is on the lateral side of the leg, which is on this side, right, on the outside. Those are the 3 muscle bundles that make up the quadriceps and dictate the volume and silhouette of the leg. When we draw it, even in mannequin form, this will have a huge impact on how that looks. The thing you should remember is that the vastus lateralis comes in a lot higher than the vastus medialis. And so this is that gestural form that you'll get, and I oftentimes see be indicated wrong, is we want that to be, that's always the case. So it comes in on top at the vastus lateralis, it comes in slightly higher or even much higher than the vastus medialis. The medialis sort of comes on the height of the patella, as you can see here, illustrated by Lex, whereas the vastus lateralis will come up quite a few inches above the knee. Moving on to another muscle is the adductor muscles, and again, we just group these together. The adductors, as their function suggests, is they adduct the leg, so they bring it towards the body. That's their main function, so they bring the leg inward, and that's their main function. And they are crossed by the sartorius muscle. So the sartorius muscle here is this muscle that goes from almost like the iliac crest where it attaches, and it runs across, and then it tucks behind the vastus medialis. Now, this will be a very big gestural indicator of the leg, the sartorius muscle. It's a very interesting muscle as well. It has a lot of functions, which we'll go over in the recap. But what it definitely does is that it kind of separates these two, where you can see this gap, right? That's what the vastus, the sartorius muscle actually does. It or almost separates the quadriceps and the vastus medialis more specifically from the adductors, and that's what will give it when we mannequinize the leg. Even it will give it that more like this kind of beanie shape when we draw the leg, right? And this is important because we sometimes also exaggerate that when we want to draw more female legs. We kind of exaggerate these adductor muscles because sometimes the adductor muscles will have a little bit more fat to them when they're covered by skin. They will have a little bit more fat reserve with women than they will do with men. So we can exaggerate that part of the leg, even in still or in mannequinization form. It's even easier to remember. We do that to suggest a certain body type. So that's the power of kind of knowing these muscles and where they will have fat reserve, what kind of gesture they will imply, and how they will look in a simplified shape. Then moving on, we have the tensor fasciae latae, which is this little muscle that sits next to the gluteus medius. But so the glute medius and the tensor fasciae latae will be on the lateral side of the hip. Now the tensor fasciae latae actually, it's a little bit misrepresented here, but it actually runs down all the way down to the knee joint. So it actually runs down all the way down to the knee joint. And its main function is to extend and externally rotate the leg around the knee joint. So it does have a very certain and specific function. But when drawing it, what we don't need to actually remember that function. It will not be a muscle that will also present itself when we flex it or when we rotate the leg. So it's just there more for functionality's sake. But if you want to remember that, it actually runs all the way down through the knee, and it's there primarily to rotate the knee joint, or rotate the leg around the knee joint. Then when we look at the side view of the leg, what we see right here, and we'll look at it from the back as well, we can identify the glute maximus and the bicep femoris. But we'll look at that from the back in a little bit more detail. As you can see, one of the major superficial muscle groups is, of course, the glutes. We have the glute medius, we also have a glute minimus and the glute maximus. It's only the glute medius and maximus that we'll really see, so it's the only ones that we'll discuss again as well. It's a very interesting muscle. It's probably the most powerful muscle in the body because it helps us literally stay erect as human beings, as bipedal animals. So it has a very large function in the body. Same with the glute medius. It actually supports that in keeping the legs and our bodies stabilized. Another thing that might be interesting to remember is the combination between the glute maximus and the glute medius and the sacrum, that actually, that triangular shape from the back, is it will sort of have this butterfly-like shape. So when we look at it from in an orthographic view, the glutes will look a little bit like, so it's a little bit of an exaggeration, of course, but the trochanter will actually peak its head around here. And so we'll have the glute medius sitting on that side, and then the glute maximus kind of makes up this butterfly-like shape. It's a little bit exaggerated the way that I've represented it, but that's sort of to give you the idea of why we sometimes refer to it as the butterfly muscle. It's because of that graphic shape that it makes together with the medius. Then one other major muscle, of course, is the bicep femoris. As you can see, again, as the name suggests, it's a muscle group with two muscle bundles, hence the name biceps. its main function is, of course, to literally curl the leg inwards, like what we do with our arm, what the bicep does to lift the lower arm. It's the same to lift the lower leg inwards on the posterior side. So as you can see, it's a major muscle group. Again, what you can remember from this muscle graphically is that it's similar to what the bicep does, except the bicep has the bicep kind of stays together a little bit more. So the biceps looks a little bit more like this, and actually it branches off into like two muscle bundles like this. But then it comes together again, and it sort of branches off like this, and then one goes underneath the acromion, and then one attaches on the inside of the arm. What the bicep femoris does, however, is it kind of splits up on the lower side of the leg into like these two little tendons that run across to the lower leg, and they actually attach on the epicondyles of the tibia. So again, it's like graphically, it's more like these two drumsticks again, these two chicken drumsticks that have a large cylindrical inflated muscle bundle, and then they kind of slowly converge into this smaller tendon, which you can actually feel. You can feel both of those tendons at the back of your knee, right? Those are the tendons of the bicep femoris. So a relatively important muscle to remember because it will make up a huge part of the silhouette of the leg. Then lastly, if we look at the inside of the leg, again, what we can see is these adductor muscles. The sartorial muscle a little bit will peek its head, but then primarily the vastus medialis, again, the inside of the quadricep muscle, will dictate a large portion of the inside of the leg when we look at it from the inside. So that's just something for you to keep in mind when you're drawing a character and you're showing the inside of the leg. Primarily, these are the muscles that you will see. Or when you're doing live drawing, same thing. So other than that, there's not much more to remember when it comes to the muscles itself anatomically. I think the only thing you would need to remember is that when we look at form, the most notable thing to remember is that the glutes, the quads, and the hamstrings make up the entire silhouette, or almost the entire silhouette. The glutes could be regarded as a sort of bean form shape, or that butterfly shape that we were talking about, with a little bit of a flattened bottom. The glutes and the medius, or the glute medius and the tensor fascia latae, could be grouped into like one simple triangular shape, which you will usually see in the Michael Hampton books as well. And I believe Bridgman does this as well. So it will be this grouping that will be this triangular shape that actually wedges in between the glutes and the anterior part of the muscles. And then the hamstrings, like I said, it's like two drumsticks actually that branch into two. But when we group them together again, we create this simplified shape that Axel has represented. That's a little bit more box-like shape. You can do it in a drumstick way as well. And then it branches off into these two tendon muscles. Overall, the main thing you should take away from this is that when you're learning the muscles, try to envision what their simplification could be. We will go over this in the simplification lessons, of course, but already do this in the upper leg portion of this lesson, is that when you're thinking about these muscles, when you're learning about these, don't get too hung up in what their names are. Think a little bit more, and even their function, just think a little bit more about where is their placement on the body and how can I simplify their form to best remember what they look like in 3D shape. Hey athletes, welcome to lesson 1 of module 4. This lesson will be focusing on the upper legs. We'll be separating them from the lower legs for better understanding. When we look at the bones of the upper leg, we can identify two distinct bone structures. We see the pelvis, where various muscles of the upper leg will attach to, and the femur, the largest bone in the body that sockets into the pelvis and ends in two epicondyles that, together with the tibia bone of the lower leg, will form the saddle joint that supports the knee. Note that the femur does not run straight down in a 90-degree angle from the pelvis. Instead, it kind of curves inward to cause less strain on the joint. Mechanically, the femur works as a ball and socket joint that allows the leg to rotate in nearly every direction. held primarily in place by the tension of the muscles it attaches to. Moving on to the muscles, we'll start by examining the muscles that make up the glutes. From the back, we can see the pelvis is covered, at least superficially, by the gluteus maximus and the gluteus medius. This muscle, like the pec major, has convergent muscle fibers and can produce a lot of force. It is probably by far the strongest muscle in the body because this is what causes us to walk upright. That's also why quadrupedal animals have a lot less developed glute muscles. On the posterior side of the upper leg, we can identify two other superficial muscle groups beside the glutes that will dictate the form of the leg. The biggest being the bicep femoris. As the name suggests, this is the bicep muscle of the femur bone that provides the leg with the ability to bend the lower leg upwards towards the glutes. Then, the adductor muscle group that sits on the medial side of the leg provides the leg the ability to bring the leg inward, literally called adduction. On the lateral side of the leg, we can identify two more muscles. We have the tensor fasciae latae, a small muscle that sits in front of the glute muscles and runs all the way down from the pelvis to the knee joint. Its main function is to extend and externally rotate the leg around that knee joint. And secondly, the vastus lateralis. This muscle is part of the quadriceps and sits on the lateral side of the muscle, hence vastus lateralis. The vastus lateralis allows us to extend our knee and bring our legs forward, another extremely powerful muscle. This muscle is also covered by a large tendon muscle called the iliotibial band, or IT band short. Moving on to the anterior side of the upper leg, we can identify 5 major superficial muscles. We have the quadricep on the front, which is a large muscle with 4 muscle groups, hence the term quadriceps, that attaches on both the pelvis or iliac crest, the femur, and the tibia. Although the quads have 4 muscles, we can only see 3 superficially. We have the vastus lateralis, like discussed earlier, the vastus medialis, and the rectus femoris. The vastus medialis gives us that iconic bump above the inside of the knee and helps create the silhouette of the shape of the leg. Then on the medial side, or the inner side of the upper leg, sit the adductors again. Covering both previous muscles is the sartorius muscle. This is a very interesting muscle for us artists, as it basically dictates the form of the upper leg as we know it, and gives it that nice flow. The sartorius has many functions, from flexion, external rotation, and abduction of the leg. Lastly, on the lateral side, we can see the tensor fasciae latae again. Again, like I said, naming these muscles will get you some bragging points, but it will not make you a better designer. Therefore, in this course, we will focus on the 3D forms these muscles represents and their function on the body. When it comes to form, the most notable thing to remember are the glutes, the quads, and the hamstring. The glutes could be regarded as a bean form with a flattened bottom on the back. The glute medius and the tensor fasciae latae could be grouped into one simple triangular shape on the lateral side of the hip, right above the trochanter of the femur. Then the hamstrings or bicep femoris look very similar in their simplified form to the triceps and lower arm. 2 small drumsticks that attach on each side of the knee joint. On the front or anterior side, the quads look like 3 elongated football shapes, where the lateral muscle, the vastus lateralis, sits notably higher than the vastus medialis on the inside of the knee. Overall, your main focus of these muscles, along with most of the muscles we'll discuss in this course, is to understand their basic form and volume along with their placement on the body. To practice this, we want you to do the following assignments. You will again trace over 10 of the images we provide in this lesson, clearly indicating where the muscles sit on the body and what their volume is. Lastly, you will add the back muscles discussed in this lesson on top of 3 skeletal images provided in the resources. Again, it's important that you do this from imagination. So that's it, athletes. We hope you have fun with this lesson, and we'll see you in the next one.